Hello and welcome to an episode of Lore Diver. This is episode 7 of the Arcane Age series, and tonight we are diving into the lore of Jam Daath, an ancient civilization that had the widest, like literally the widest, distribution of survivors going into the modern era. It is pretty wild. It is also the most unique nation of the era, in my opinion at least, in that instead of relying on magic like so many other groups did, instead they used psionics, which is, a nice change from the norm. So, yeah, psychic powers, psiocracy. How cool is that? All right, so before we start, if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. If you dig what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on either Ko-fi or Patreon. I've got links up here on Twitch and over on my various social media. So let's get into this. All right, so Jam Daath, coexisting powers and their relationships. Jam Daath reaches back all the way into the deep Antiquity era that I started this all off, and it was founded in minus 5,800 DR, and it shares this era with Imiskar, the Elven Nation of Nykirimeth, the various predecessor states of Kalimshan, and a bunch of Elven splinter states. And at their height, they actually bridge the divide between what we now know as Kalimshan at its maximum extent, all the way over to Imiskar at its maximum extent. It's pretty awesome. If you haven't yet, take a look over on my blog at the Arcane Age Primer. There's a map there, and it'll show you just how big this place was. It's pretty outstanding. So they were huge. And for all intents and purposes that I can tell, they have pretty good relationships with everybody. They're one of the few groups that actually has some notes about how they interacted with people. At one point, they were a major naval power, protecting the Sea of Fallen Stars. And aside from some dust-ups with Kalimshan, doing pretty well, which is kind of odd. Most of the time, a lot of these empires back in the day are pretty awful. So, moving on into Antiquity, this is the minus 4,000 to minus 1,000 DR cohort of time. So this is where Jam Daath reaches its greatest heights. Like, it is way up there, flying high, life is good. All 12 of its sword cities are established, and it sees multiple conflicts with neighboring elves at Nykirimeth and with Kalimshan's various predecessor states around the Lake of Steam. They just really get into it in this era. They're trading with Nethril and with Imiskar, maintaining good relations with both of those groups. Like, Imiskar doesn't try to annex them or conquer them, and Nethril makes a very wise decision, one of the few wise decisions in their existence. And it's like, we could go fight these crazy psychics, or we could not. And they opted for that. So, statistically speaking, they were bound to make a good decision eventually. So that was it. Also of interest in this particular era is that it absorbs a large number of refugees from Imiskar when it falls, and goes into a number of conflicts against Unther and Unther's colony Chesenta. Now, the Fall of Magic, the minus 1,000 to 1 DR, this is when things go from zenith to nadir in a heartbeat. And all it takes is one coup d'etat. Like, one single scion decides that everything would be better if they were an emperor instead of working with this system of, what are they called there again? The Blade Lords, which were cleric scions. Instead of working under the council that's been working for ages, this guy's like, nope, it's better off under me, and I want to take over more land. Everything gets wiped out in classic elven fashion, as the elves commit a giant war crime to eliminate their opponents, wiping out the entirety of not the entirety, the majority of their sword cities with a tsunami that creates the Vilhan Reach. Little overreaction? Yeah. Oh man, yeah, elves. Damn. So, broad overview. Jam Daath kicked off everything with a difference. Instead of defaulting to magic, the peoples there started developing psionic powers. And this is very unusual, pardon me, outside of games like Dark Sun, where psionics were extremely common. This plunked a psionic empire right down in the middle of the map. And they rapidly shifted from being an oligarchy to a psiocracy. So they sort of became their own, like they developed a caste system and based on psionic power and position, and they ran with that for a long time and finally became a psionic empire after that coup d'etat I just mentioned. Now, they also had a lot of big-time resources, namely in crystals. Like the number of psionic crystal artifacts they created and that are still kicking around and that are at the bottom of the Vilhan Reach is frankly mind-blowing. Like, it is... The area is criminally underused, in my opinion, as a subsetting within the realms. Like, it should have a completely different monster ecosystem and adventuring ecosystem than the world that surrounds it, because it is that different. So, yeah, like, a lot of frustration researching this one. Not because it was badly written, but because, wow, there's so much lost potential. So now, Jam Daath itself is introduced in 3rd edition. I wasn't able to find any firm indications of it in prior editions, and it makes a very brief reappearance in 4th edition in the Vilhan Wilds, where the receding sea of fallen stars has exposed some of the ruined cities to the surface. But that was as far as anything went in that edition, so it only appears in 2. And as a result, there's been no real retcons, changes, or reimaginings of it since its initial introduction. However, in order to get its full spectrum of interactions with the nations around it, you had to pick through a lot of information to get it, which I found kind of irritating at times. Now, what are its names? It's known as Jam Daath, the Jam Daath Psiocracy, or the 12 Cities of the Sword. And these, in my mind, can best be thought of as what a common person would know of it today, know of it as today, which would be Jam Daath. So if you were to ask a Jhaamdathan from that region where their people came from, they might tell you they came from Jam Daath. And that's about as far as it would go. For a more scholarly approach, they may know it as the Jam Daath Psiocracy. So they know that not only was there an empire there, but it was a psiocracy. It was a different power base and different organization. And 12 Cities of the Sword, this is an archaic phrase. Like, this is something that I would expect to hear during its age of existence, not so much in the modern age, unless you're talking to like a giant history or archaeology nerd who doesn't want to use the common names for it. It happens. Anyways, and that would be, of course, in-game. Dates of existence. It was founded in minus 5800 DR and collapsed in minus 255 DR with the destruction of the majority of its cities. Unlike other locations across the Forgotten Realms, they were largely unaffected by magic turning off temporarily when Karsus did his whole Karsus's avatar trick and flicked everything off for a minute. The reason being that they were psionic. They had no real use for magic. It wasn't something they were into, so nil effects. Like, didn't really phase them at all. So that's, good. Main being wiped out in minus 255 DR. Not so good, but whatever. Talk about that in a minute. So, geospatial information. Now, this Jam Daath, at its greatest extent, covers modern Termish, part of the Dragon Coast, goes down to the Lake of Steam area through the Shining Plains, follows along the Chandlewood is Verboten. That's an area they don't control, but they control all the areas around it. They also controlled modern-day Chesenta and part of modern-day Unther as well. And over the course, that's at their greatest extent. Now, they began losing territory as the years went on. They came to a détente with Kalimshan and sort of had a little border down there. So that area remained relatively steady. And that's where countries like Sespach and Lhan Daath and so on would be in the future. Likewise, their area around Termish and the Dragon Coast, that remained fairly stable as well. However, it was their easternmost lands that they began to lose. And that started happening shortly after Imiskar fell. Because while the Mulhorandi Mulan people were happy sticking around where they were, the Unthorites were filled with the bloodlust, wanted to wipe out everything to do with all their former masters when they were slaves, and were actively pursuing all the Tarami and Imiskari refugees westwards. And this brought them smack into Jam Daath territory. And Jam Daath would fight with Unther and eventually come up with a bit of a détente area, not a détente, a ceasefire zone, for lack of a better description, that more or less follows, I believe it's the Meth River. Hang on a moment here, just zoom in. Oh, sorry, the Winding River. So that's nice. The Methmere and Methwood are not fed by the Meth River. That's excellent. So more or less along the Winding River. However, that was not to last. Unther would wage a series of expansionist conflicts, establishing colonies up in modern-day Chesenta that will become Chesenta. And this eats away at Jam Daath's land until eventually they're more or less just along what will be the Vilhan Reach and in the mountains of the Akinol area. Like that's in Termish. That's about it. That's towards the end of everything, right as they become an empire and decide they're going to go full on and try to start conquering people again. They also had a lot of influence on what would become Algorand, so that's the elven nation of Wairi Shanyar. I think I pronounced that very wrong, but that's what happens when you put that many vowels into a single name. Wow. And as I said earlier, the Chondathans will become, common throughout everything. I'll get into that in the survivor state part of it. So that's at its high point and its low point. It was a fairly expansive area. Now, and it's as far as general culture goes, Jam Daath was a caste system, and Scions were on top, and everybody else was underneath. Now, their god, they were unique because they only worshipped one god. So this is Openser, the god of thinking, intellect, and clear mind, psychic abilities, all that sort of good stuff. Openser immediately banned slavery. However, banning slavery and having a caste system doesn't really work as well as one would imagine it would be. So while they didn't have slaves in the conventional sense, there was definitely an underclass of people that did all the work that the non-Scions didn't want to do. And so that's more or less how they worked. Now, the Scions themselves also divided themselves up into their own little castes, basically based around like their power levels, jobs, tasks, and all that sort of stuff. So they had Psyarchs, soldiers, scribes, and commoners. With the Psyarchs being in the lead, soldiers underneath them, many of those being Scions as well, especially the officer class. Scribes, there's scribes. And finally commoners. And commoners, that's where like the overwhelming bulk of the civilization was. And there's nothing really to indicate they were awful. They weren't particularly violent. They weren't particularly bloodthirsty. They actually expanded into 12 city-states. The Cities of the Sword, as I was talking about earlier. And became known for their swordsmanship. And this is where things get a little bit weird. Because I really feel like when this was being written, they had two competing ideas for what they wanted to do with this with this nation. And I think on one hand there is a group creatively who wanted to create a swashbuckling naval power renowned for their swordsmanship. And on the other side of the conversation, I believe there was a group who wanted to turn them into a really, really kick-ass psion and psychic power-based civilization with all the trappings of that. Floating crystals, psychic weapons, all that good stuff. And I don't think either side managed to convince the other that their vision was best. So they sort of mashed the two together and called it a day. Because, like, they're known for their swordsman. Like, what makes sense to you? A nation of scions that is known for their swordsmen and, like, their swordsmanship, or a nation of scions known for their psychic abilities. To me, I think that a nation that is known for its, or that is a psiocracy and has all these powerful psychics in it, is probably known for that more than their amazing swordsmanship. Like, the swordsmanship, absolutely. Like, yeah, that's fine. But I don't think they would be as well. And this is, like, all through, like, everything to do with them is, like, there's the sword lords, the sword cities, the sword this, the sword that. Like, it's outrageous. Anyways, aside from some conflicts with the nation that would become Kalimshan and with the elves of Nekirimath, they're pretty chill overall, which is kind of a nice breath of fresh air after covering Nethril and Imiskar, two of the worst examples of writing in the game. Here, come here. Swashbuckler. Yes. That. I don't even know how to pronounce that properly. I guess it would be like swashbuckler. Swashbuckler. That's outstanding. I love that. The other notable thing about them is that they only had one god. They followed Opensor, god, as I said, god of thinking, intellect, all that good stuff. And this was the state deity, and his faith was the state religion. And Jam Daath is kind of unique in Antiquity for both having a religion that's not demonstrably awful and one that was effectively monotheist. They didn't have any additional gods, which I find kind of interesting. So you got a comment here. Yeah, sword fighting is cool, but it's not exactly unique to them. Yeah, exactly. Like, everybody's good at sword fighting. You have to be. But they have. Oh my god. That's terrible. That's dad joke, is what that is. That is dad joke level commentary happening. Oh my god. All right. Pushing on. So, Opensor was the state deity and was not awful and appears to have run a pretty good show. It wasn't until the Blade Lords, which is a group of note that I'm just going to slide right into, were overthrown in a coup that everything sort of went sideways. The Blade Lords were these cleric scions. There's a Blade Lord per city, and yeah, there's really not a ton of information about them. It's a little bit disappointing, but at the same time, it is understandable because of how they all died so very, very suddenly. Now, history in the editions. This is really fast. First edition, nothing. I couldn't find anything about Jam Daath at all. It's possibly one of the many lost civilizations that's mentioned. Bear in mind that first edition Forgotten Realms was a very bare bones creation. Like, they didn't even use a fraction of the information they got from Ed Greenwood to develop it. It was a very, very almost post-apocalyptic sounding setting where, like, nations were falling out of contact with each other all over the place. Nobody really knew the history of the world and all that sort of good stuff. So second edition, same as first edition. The areas around it, however, become more developed. And finally, third edition. This is when Jam Daath comes into the picture in a big way. It is featured in the Lost Empires of Faerun, the Grand History of the Realms, and it's established not just as a place, but as a regional power, which is pretty sweet. And the end of their nation is tied to basically their unrelenting warfare in the region between elves and humans. Yeah, Vilhan Reach is not a great place. Literally, the Chonelwood area is not a great place to be a human. And being an elf in Jam Daath was not a great way to go either. Bad action all around. 4th edition, same as 3rd. But because the Sea of Fallen Stars, there we go. Gotta remember the names of things. Because it had receded, some of the cities were exposed and crawling with freaky monsters. But none of that was actually explored in any way, shape, or form, because 4th edition died before it had a chance to really do anything with the plot lines that it was setting up, and only some of those plot lines actually got to move forwards. Now, 5th edition. 5th edition is more or less back to the 3rd edition standard. Insofar as I'm aware, the Vilhan Reach has refilled. The survivor states, however, have had very differing outcomes, and I will be covering the survivor states in this episode because there's only 2 of them, and it's not a ton of crazy stuff to cover in about them. Now, the history is presented. So, minus 5800 DR, Jam Daath is founded. Good times. It is founded by a warrior named Jam. That's Jhaam. Or maybe it's Jame. I'm not sure. Who becomes the namesake of the place. Jam fails to conquer all the stuff and establish a kingdom. But, oh, hey, good to see you. Yeah, glad you managed to catch the episode live. He managed, his kids managed to establish Jam Daath. They name it after dear old dad, who was named Jam. Maybe Jame. Not sure. So the first city of the sword is founded a mere 50 years later. And that is Nerkolth. Clythe. Not going to pronounce that well at all. And they get going with all that good stuff. You know, so now they've got a city, they got some land, life's good. And bear in mind, at this point, the Vilhan Reach does not exist. So when you look at the map that I have up on the blog, just imagine the Vilhan Reach is filled in with land. It's a nice, beautiful, rolling plain, fertile and full of happy, cheerful people that are living their best lives. So in minus 5730, this is when Openser makes contact with a Scion mystic named Lasik. Same as the eye surgery, Lasik. And delivers to Jam Daath his plan for making the place great. Bans slavery, establishes everything and establishes how everything's going to roll more or less for the next, 5,000 odd years. Now, this is pretty cool because you get to things start to get kind of unique now, and there's a lot of stuff that isn't fully explained or isn't explained well. And one of these is the Urugias. Now, the Urugias, this ties in because Lasik, our good friend with good eyesight, creates the first Urugias, which is a powerful psionic artifact for the city of N. I'm just going to call it City of N. I'm not pronouncing that name anymore. And what these things do is those with psionic abilities who eventually touch it are granted access to more power. And these effects are felt for miles beyond the main location. And these are, for all intents and purposes, Mythalars, but for Scions. And there's a bunch of them. There's one eventually made, I believe, for each city. And not all of them were lost. So there's some powerful psionic broadcasting stuff, just at the bottom of the Reach. Gonna get into why you shouldn't go swimming in the Vilhan Reach eventually. You guys are gonna love it. So, he invents those, ends up founding the Eudiclean a few years later, which is a university for studying psionic powers. And finally, in minus 5700, Jam Daath replaces its old government, which was an oligarchy. So basically, it replaces its aristocracy with a psiocracy. Everything kind of gets really interesting now. For like the next few millennia, you have a whole bunch of construction that goes on. Jam Daath begins to expand, bumps into the nation of Mir, starting the first Mir Jam Daath war, and defeats them solidly, which leads Khorramshan to join with Mir to stop Jam Daath's expansion southwest. And then eventually the two of them like call it off after fighting for like a few hundred years around the Lake of Steam. They're tired of it. The beholders that live there are tired of it. Nobody wants to deal with it anymore. And they're done. And at that point, Mir and Khorramshan merge and form Kalimshan. So I get sword cities are being built every few hundred years. Everything carries. Like, I'm not going to read everything out to you because like it's just a litany of how everything was built. Now, where things got interesting is in minus 2488 DR. And this may sound familiar from you from the last couple of episodes with Imiskar. And that's because a wave of Tarami refugees from fallen Imiskar, and most likely some Imiskari as well, arrive in Jam Daath territory. They are being chased by Proto-Unthrites and do not want to have to deal with that sort of nonsense. And what happens is the Jam Daath Psiocracy accepts them and resettles all these refugees in the Granite Gates province, which is the future site of Termish. It's apparently not inhabited by any humans and only has like a few dwarf colonies and a few like little elf settlements in it. So they just drop them all there. And Tarami remains part of Jam Daath right till its end. And I'll get into that in the survivor states because Termish is a lot cooler and has a lot more stuff going on it than a lot of people may suspect. So, yeah. Beholders start attacking people in Kalimshan and Jam Daath around minus 2381 DR. And finally, using a bit of magic and sonic powers, the noble families of Jam Daath construct a magical refuge at Dinalith, which is a secure pocket plane accessible only from the main palace. Probably a good plan. Now, everything goes sideways in the year minus 276 DR. So this is when a militant emperor, and I don't even think they mentioned the emperor's name. Let me just look here quick. Yeah, no, they don't even mention this person's name. Let's fast forward. Hang on, I'm just fast forwarding through all my research here. Jam Daathans. Here we go. The great metamind Darien. There's always some dude named Darien. Anyways, seizes control of Jam Daath in a bloody coup and establishes himself as tyrant. So after over 5,000 years of everything going awesome, steady and maintainable expansion and development, one dude named Darien decides it's go time, and wipes out the Blade Lords, establishes himself as emperor, builds a great navy, and decides that it is time to conquer everything, and sets their eyes on the Chandal wood first. Why? Because he needs more wood. Now, there's two problems with this. One, there are a lot of easier sources of wood to get to. They're all up in Termish. They are incredibly accessible and are not filled with an elven nation of lunatics who have been fighting a non-stop guerrilla war against every single logger and forest industry attempt to enter their land. But Darien wants that wood. And so Darien marches out and begins slaughtering elves like crazy through the Trundlewood for the next 20 years. And it's bad. He brings the full force of Jam Daath's military might into the commentator. Great swordsman, terrible Catan player. Exactly. Full military force onto it. It's like they're at the point where they're showing the elves what war crimes can be. And this leads to minus 255 DR, the year of furious waves. And this is where I comment here. That's a way to enter a forever war. It is, until the elves decide that it's war crime o'clock, and that the best way to deal with this is to simply remove the offending nation. So they use elven high magic to call an enormous tidal wave and literally wipe out Jam Daath. They send it smashing right down that nice little valley that they're in, and creates the modern Lhan Reach. Millions and millions of people, many of them psychic, die immediately. Don't go swimming in Lhan Reach. Get into that in a second. Now, that's the end of Jam Daath. The next date where they're mentioned is 144, which is the year of Fear and Flame, where Jhaamdath is founded on the ruins of Jam Daath. Comment here, what's another war crime to the elves at this point? That's really true. War crime seems to be how the elves solve all of their problems in the Forgotten Realms. And it's never minor. It's always like a massive one that ends up scarring the land and the world for millennia to follow. Ugh. So, we're just going to do a quick talk here on its known and possible survivor states. So, the only proper survivor states that it spun out were Jhaamdath and Turmish. Now, Jhaamdath, it existed from 144 DR to 1386 DR. A very good run in terms of surviving in the Forgotten Realms, and was at the end of 3rd edition was gearing up to try to become, or sorry, in 2nd edition and coming into 3rd edition, it was preparing to try to become the Jhaamdath of the past, when they were big and covered a lot of more territory and were in charge of more stuff. Yeah, this didn't last. The spell plague wiped them out. Like, it was minus 255 all over again, pretty much. Huge chunks of the land were exchanged with Abir, and during the aptly named whaling years that followed, natural disasters pummeled the region. Jhaamdath was wiped out. Like, how badly were they wiped out? After the after the reset that happened with the Sundering and the entrance into 5th edition, Jhaamdath is still gone. There is no mention of the nation of Jhaamdath as an extant place in 5th edition. It is gone. It is one of the few permanent casualties of 4th edition. However, all is not doom and gloom, because Jhaamdathans are the most common ethnic group on Faerun. And I literally mean that. Like, if you dig out the old Races of Faerun book from 3rd edition, Jhaamdathans are the main population, or a significant part of the population, of just about every nation that touches the Sea of Fallen Stars, south down to the Lake of Steam, through the Heartlands, and onto the Sword Coast. They are everywhere. And they run the gamut from sort of like dark olive with dark hair, where they were originally down around the Lhan Reach in that place, through lighter skin tones, brown hair, all that sort of stuff, as they sort of like span across through the north, wherever they mixed. It's a situation where they're described as having some common features and some common culture left, but each group is fairly distinct. Like, for example, Sembia is mostly Jhaamdathans, so is Cormyr. They are radically different nations, radically different cultures. So there's some issues there with the understanding of how culture, ethnic groups, and all that sorts of stuff work, writing-wise. However, they are literally everywhere. Except for Jhaamdath, because Jhaamdath's gone. Now, Turmish. Turmish is an extremely unique location that, in my opinion, has not been well used, despite all the developments that have influenced it. And I say this because Turmish has a unique distinction of being the survivor state of not one but two major nations. The Turami that settled there and would eventually form the population that Turmish exists with today were all survivors from Imiskar. And so they were the high priests, the priests, clerics, engineers, scribe. They were like the middle class and the skilled laborer pool when they showed up. And then there were survivor states of Imiskar, and there's survivor state of Jam Daath as well, because Jam Daath was their home for over 2,000 years. So it's over 2,000 years of influence from this Scion powered operation. And it's also the last nation standing that has direct roots with both of those nations. Like, there's no other group like them on the planet. Pardon me. Now, Turmish had a bad go during the Spell Plague, effectively becoming almost like a Somalia-style failed state. It was all bad, all the time. However, things appear to be turning around in 5e. The write-up in Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide is extremely positive and extremely rosy, which is kind of nice to see, because like all the other, like, basically black parts of the realms in 4th edition, they took the absolute worst of it. So, in Turmish itself, the best thing that I can say about Turmish is that almost anything that you reimagine that isn't racist is probably going to be better than what was written for it originally in 2nd edition, which is the only edition that really dug into that location, because none of the stuff there makes sense. It's filled with contradictions, filled with just like not nonsensical aspects, and just does not read well. Also, it has them wearing armor with minarets on it. Let's see, we got a comment. Turmish, Ultimate Survivors. Yes. Another comment here. And there's Turmish Descension in the center. Yeah, there's a lot of Turmish crops up in there's an NPC in the Descent into Avernus. There's also another one in these there's several in the Storm King's Thunder as well. And they form part of the town security force, which is not unusual because Turmish produces mercenaries the same way that other places produce, like, goods that won't kill you. Like, seriously, Turmish produces a crazy amount of mercenaries, and they're super efficient and super deadly. Really cool. But just the descriptions of their armor are terrible. It reads that like they're inspired by elven architecture, and so they covered their armor with like little spiky minaret things, and it's just no, don't do that. All right, so that's their survivor state. So there's one other one that's not really a survivor state per se, more of a potentially nightmarish adventure location if you really want to have your players experience all the nightmares and challenges of facing off against some of the most dangerous monsters that the game has to throw at them. And that is the city of Lhan Daath. So Lhan Daath, not Lhan Daath. Lhan Daath was a survivor state of Netheril. Lhan Daath is a separate independent city-state, which still exists insofar as I know. Lhan Daath is bad news. Lhan Daath is currently, last I read, it was run openly by Yuan Ti. They had completely infiltrated the ruling classes of the city, established serpent cult as the normal, everyday religion of the place. So yes, the Vere cult is everywhere there. So in the city itself, it is a giant mercantile city with a giant military force. Everything is snake themed. There are flying snakes as pets, And it is a place where purebloods, abominations, and Malisons can walk around openly without being particularly worried about anything. So that's the surface. And that alone, if you're using challenge rating system, pops potential things in the just in the city up into the 7-8 range. If you make mistakes and run into the wrong people. It's what's under the city that makes it extra deadly, because Lhan Daath was not built on regular ground like a normal person might build it. No, because that would make sense. It was instead built on the ruins of Liramar. Liramar was one of the few cities that was not destroyed by the Elven High magic that sent that tsunami smashing down everything. Liramar survived. It was badly damaged, but it survived. And that's what Lhan Daath was built on top of. So Lhan Daath is built on top of a giant psychic graveyard filled with psionic artifacts, probably with one of those, how do I pronounce that again? Most likely with one of those, Ukes? Udogia? Is it Udogia? Udogias. Probably with an Udogia there. Attracting all of the terrifying, psionically hungry monsters, things from the astral plane, and things like that, into it to try to gain access to it. So it's effectively a mega dungeon, because it was a city. So it's effectively a mega dungeon full of psionic everything that wants to eat your brain and or soul, that is underneath a city that is overrun by, and literally run by, the Yuan-Ti and their followers, which means that there are most likely Suruk in the area by now, taking advantage of the fact that there's a place where they can operate more or less openly. So, yeah, that's a place in the game right now. So if you want to do that to your characters, want to do that to your players, just hit one of those sites that prints out giant dungeon maps and just go bananas. Print them all out, stack them all up, and see who makes it. Let's see here. Question: are there inhabitants under Lhan Daath? Probably. My guess would be there's probably all sorts of weird Yuan-Ti stuff, and then after you break through that, that's when you get into your weird psionic things. Not to mention the Underdark in that area is flooded, if I remember correctly. So you've got underwater psionic nightmare going on for chunks of it. So there's a lot of things that go on. I mean, I would pack the place with, mind flayers and elder brains and all those themed creatures. And then I would probably dip hard into the second edition stuff, because they had a lot of freaky psychic monsters and astral plane monsters that would go fantastic in that location. Now, my take on Jam Daath. Okay. I'm not going to break this down as I've been doing it, where I've been talking about it like Great Antiquity, all sorts of stuff, because Jam Daath was very steady through its entire existence. So I'm going to talk about it as a whole, in a way to approach it. Because I feel it's been underutilized in every way. And the first big thing is that Jam Daath and its environs deserve to be its own subsetting. A completely different ecosystem of adventure than players and DMs are most likely used to. And that is because instead of being based on magic, a lot of the stuff there is based on psionic powers instead. So dust off all the the complete psionic handbook, the expanded psionics from 3rd edition, look into how 4th edition did, all that sort of thing, because that's how that region was. So that means different monsters, you're not going to be running into kobolds, orcs, and stuff like that. Well, still run into orcs, but probably terrifying psychic orcs. All that sort of stuff. It needs to be there. It will make the place different and give it a unique feel. In broad strokes, I love the idea of a psionic empire. I do not like how it was completely wiped out. There were actually some places lived more or less. For example, the sword city of Jornum. I'm going to call it Jurnum. The city of Jurnum, it actually was protected by its hills, and only parts of it were sunk. And it has it as being overgrown with barnacles and ropey sea plants, and now there's a sea hag witch queen there, and who are ruling over the sunken city, being served by colonths. That's cool, but I like the idea of having at least one survivor city left from this. I mean, you don't make it for 5,000 years and not have something left over. See, I'm going to comment here. It'd be cool if Wizards finally sorted the psionic system. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic. If once they get their psionic system hammered out, if they ever can, and they just applied all their attention to this place, I think it would be phenomenal. The number of stories and the amount of stuff you could do with it is outstanding. But as I was saying, the Jurnum, the idea of a partially sunken city where you have part of it is still occupied by humans, the other part's maybe held by monsters or something like that. It just has a lot more potential to me than simply saying yep, this is a treasure trove of gold, gems, and psionically charged magic items. Throw some quotes up around that magic from the city's vaults and armory being held by monsters. That's just a super basic approach to something that I think could be a lot cooler. And there's then there's why we don't go into the Reach. Vilhan Reach, if I were to describe it, I would describe it as being super haunted. Not normal haunted, not there's a few ghosts, look out guys. No, it is super haunted. Millions of scions died at once. That does not create a healthy environment. And the worst part is that they actually dipped their toes into this and then pulled back. They didn't go all the way with it. Because the city of N, the old capital city, the imperial capital, no one's ever found it. The few people who've braved the bottom of the Reach have not been able to locate it. However, every so often, when night comes, the city appears floating above the water of the Reach, and then fades away when the sun comes, and nobody really knows what's going on. And the city is only occupied by one thing. It's a giant undead cloud of psionic energy that looks like millions of screaming faces. That's it. I'm sorry, the description says thousands, but I imagine millions. I think that's a bigger number. But yeah, they're screaming in silent horror and anguish and haunting the ever-loving hell out of this place. And then they had sword wraiths. And this was I say throwaway comments a lot. I run into throwaway sentences and throwaway paragraphs all the time when I'm going through research for this stuff. And I keep talking about how pardon me. And I keep talking about how these are the things that they needed to develop instead of the generic or the stuff that was actually there. In 3rd edition, they introduced the sword wraiths. Within days of the elves inundating the Reach and killing all those people, psionic undead began manifesting and walking out of it. These are the sword wraiths. And their sole goal was to kill, preferably elves. And apparently the problem was minor until relatively recently something had changed. So this is like just before the spell plague. And all of a sudden, more sword wraiths were emerging. They were wiping out villages, attacking settlements, and just laying waste to anything elven they could find, that they could lay their undead eyes on. And then it just drops that plot line. Just that was the end of it. It was, oh hey guys, these incredibly powerful psionic undead are rising from the Lhan Reach. Their mission is vengeance for their untimely and unjust deaths at the hands of the elves, who committed a giant war crime because that was easier than using their words. And yeah, they're trying to wipe out everything along the shoreline, and they're heading inland to kill more elves. Strikes me as something might be worth following up. Why are so many appearing? Why are more of them appearing? And bear in mind, they are unaffected by the spell plague. Spell plague does not bother them. Neither does, the spell scarring and all, the areas of unstable magic. None of that bothers them because these are psionic undead. Just walking out to do battle. So yeah, reasons why I don't go swimming in the Lhan Reach right there. Now, back onto Sonic Empire stuff. There's so many cool things to do with this location. If you're playing at basically any point in its history, you've got conflicts with what will become Kalimshan. You've got battles against the Unthorites, and you actually have a mixed bag of like morality, ethics, and everything else to work with, because against the Unthorites, it's a defensive conflict where they're trying to protect their lands and protect these refugee populations that were fleeing from the Unthorites from them. And on the other hand, you have expansionistic imperial warfare against another expansionistic imperial force. So there's lots of really neat things going on. There's the social aspects that can be developed. The commoners, the scribes, the soldiers, the Psyarchs, the sword lords, all that sort of thing. Like, this is all awesome stuff that could be developed so much further than was actually taken in the limited material that they appear in. And of course, you've got what happens when Netheril falls, because Netheril collapses before Jam Daath does. So is Jam Daath one of the locations that sees a sudden influx of magically capable individuals, giving them an edge? Maybe that's the cause of Darian's decision to take over, is he's exposed to some Netherese concepts about life, the universe, and everything, and decides, hey, like, this is how I want to take it. The whole region, like as I was saying, unique monsters and all that sort of good stuff. There's a ton of fantastic creatures from previous editions that could be brought up and sorted out. Let's see, I got a comment here. Oh snap, I see a lake river in the south of Jhaamdath called the Nagawater and the Nagaflow. Yeah, the Nagawater and the Nagaflow, it's actually like inhabited by tons of or was inhabited by tons of Naga, and they have like treasure and a bunch of stuff. There's actually Wemmick tribes down there too, that dominate the Shining Plains, and the area became infested with undead in 4th edition because the Naga waters dried up and a bunch of the Nagas died, and then rose undead guardians over the treasure that was there. So there's like all sorts of cool potential in that area, and I hope that the location will be developed further, because yeah, like you look at the map and you've got there's the Naga flow, then let's see here, get into the right area. Yeah, Nagaflow, Nagawater. You've got all sorts of rivers going through that area. The Winterwood, Ankwood, Thornwood. There's a lot of potential for the region, and it's never been fully developed for like reasons. Anyways, so the big things I think that this setting, this particular area would do well with, in addition to all that stuff, trade. Like how they're trading with the other major powers. There could be a lot of fun cloak and dagger stuff for people who prefer games with some intrigue and so on in it. Like, this is a fantastic location because, with the exception of a few conflicts that they had, it was pretty neutral between a lot of the major powers for a long time. It's also a great way to introduce characters into new powers, new adventures, all that sort of good stuff. And I think about the only other big thing that I'd mention that I'd do anything with is with those Urojias. So the Urojias need development. There was a whole vibe in second and third edition around ancient cultures developing in the front realms, developing ways to magnify, intensify, or otherwise like expand their powers, whether it was magic or psionics. And like, these things are cool. Like a multi-mile psionic enhancing device. That's awesome. Like that's high fantasy is what it is. And I would want to develop more around that. Like, what technologies did they develop? Like, did they even use livestock for stuff, or had they developed, crystal and sonic power based methods of transit and transport? Because they weren't using magic, so they weren't teleporting, at least not conventionally. Like all that sort of stuff. Like, I would want to develop all of those things and introduce them. If you're playing in the era, it's stuff that your characters have access to, and it changes how they move around and how they interact with the world. And if you bring it into the future, and these are artifacts that are being found by modern day adventurers, like, this is huge stuff. Like, this is like literally game changing, but not game breaking sorts of items that can just enhance the reasons to adventure there, because find this cool stuff. So yeah, there it is. That is my take on the Jam Daath Psiocracy. Incredibly powerful group. Let's see, I got a question here. Do sonic brains taste better than normal brains? Asking for an elephant grown. I would go with probably yes. I imagine that it'd be the difference. Like, to use a car analogy, eating a regular brain would be like regular fuel. Eating a Scion's brain would probably be like high octane fuel for them. They would likely love it. Which is why I would throw a whole bunch. I would make that like a whole issue they were dealing with the entire time the Empire existed, was constant incursions by illithids trying to get at their delicious brains. So, next episode. I see your comment. Sorry. I love these comments here. Silent equivalent for the Nethril China. It is. It absolutely. I cannot. I practice saying this thing, and I cannot say it for the life of me without looking at it. The Urojias are very much an analog for the Netherese giant, the Mythalars, their giant crystal balls. Given that they were created so much earlier, I would even argue that encountering Jam Daath, like by the Netherese and Netherese wizards, may have been what ultimately inspired them to make the Mythalars. Like, when they encountered these things, because it's a power source they couldn't tap into, but they understand the idea of enhancing their powers and giving their all that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely, that is a very apt description. Now, next episode, Corman Thier, the here and gone again kingdom that cannot make its mind up, and that is alternatively loved and hated by writers. Yeah, Corman Thier is going to be a trip, which is a good thing that I'm not going to be covering it until the 1st of March. So it's going to be a 2-week gap here because, pardon me, next weekend is Valentine's Day weekend, or Valentine's weekend, and the week after that I am on exercise. So be getting my army on. So I'll be back on March 1st, where I'll be covering Corman Thier. And it should be pretty interesting. Comment here, all that Moonsea love. Yep, all the Moonsea action and all the, are we a nation? Are we not? Should we exist? Maybe not. Oh, A writer's destroyed us. Better wait a few hundred years till we're back. Again, action that you can deal with. So, March 1st, I will see you all then. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Lord Iver, a POCGamer podcast. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to see more, head over to my blog, POCGamer.com, and check out POCGamer on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I swear I am trying to get better on Instagram, but I am very active on Twitter. Hey, if you'd like to support this podcast, there's links to my coffee and Patreon on my blog and in social media. The music was provided by purple-planet.com. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.